there's some mechanism by which we understand a truth better from a story than we do from facts listed on a page.
Welcome to Tales with the Sales, where we discuss stories that matter because you are living one. I'm your host, Jane DeSales. I'm a writer, poet, and storyteller. It is my pleasure to introduce you to authors as we explore how fiction impacts our lives and culture. My guest today is Carolyn Astfalk. She is the author of the contemporary Catholic romances Stay With Me, Come Back to Me, Ornamental Graces, and All in Good Time. Carolyn is the president of the Catholic Writers Guild, and she is a CatholicMom.com contributor. She lives with her husband and 4 children in Hershey, Pennsylvania, where it smells like either chocolate or manure, depending on wind direction. Welcome, Carolyn. We're so glad that you could join us today. And here we're going to jump on in, and I would love to hear what literature you've brought for us today.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. I brought Tortured Soul by Teresa Linden, and Teresa has been a critique partner of mine for, oh my goodness, must be almost 10 years now. And she's probably influenced my writing more than most anybody else. So this book is actually a bit of a thriller, and it's about a soul trapped in purgatory that is, quote unquote, haunting somebody. And so this little passage I can talk about later, but I think really highlights the intersection of our the physical, natural world and the supernatural, and how integral they are. Dropping his head, he let out a miserable groan that shuddered through the house, rattling decorations, pictures, and the crucifix in the hallway. A long second later, he disappeared. Silence fell on the house, and a sick feeling in the pit of Jeannie's stomach. Jeannie sat upright and peered at the spot where he just stood. Her gaze darted from corner to corner, shadow to shadow, but he was gone. Her muscles released their anxious tension, but her mind continued to race. Where does he go when he's not here? Why does God allow him to haunt me? Doesn't a soul have to remain confined to its final resting place? True, purgatory wasn't final, but still, it was beyond the grave, and he should stay there.
Ooh,
Yes.
And he should stay there.
He should. He's awfully creepy in this book.
Oh.
So what Teresa does so well, I think, is, and I think her tagline is like things visible and invisible, basically. And so she brings to life a lot of the physical world melded with the supernatural, the spiritual world. And I think that's something that's really lacking a lot of times in our life today. And it's so easy to succumb to that, to think that all we see is all there is, and live that way, and not live as if there is something more than this, something greater, something we don't quite understand, that's beyond us, that requires an act of faith. So that's why this book in particular, I think, really, aside from its fun creepiness, really brings that to life and makes you think about what I hope I'm accomplishing when I write too, is that there's more to our actions, to our lives, than what we just see. There's a whole realm beyond that we need to account for and live as if we believe it exists.
Yeah, that definitely is something that seems to be lacking in a lot of our modern conversations. It seems to be a strictly materialistic worldview, largely.
Right. And again, that's the world we live in. It's so easy to live that way. I can, myself, from time to time, I'll be reading a little gospel reflection or something, and it really stops you like, well, how am I living? Do I really believe what I say I believe? Do I live that way? Or I just go on acting like, this busyness and these things, and what's really kind of pettiness, are they really the things that matter to me or not?
Oh, you just did a mic drop there. That it's not just encountering in the fiction, but how does it affect your life? Like that you're encountering it in fiction as well as in scripture, and saying, hey, what's the deal, people? And this is the reason I love starting this show with just straight up whatever it is my guest wants to read, because it opens up just these amazing conversations, and it exemplifies this point that fiction impacts life and culture. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into this. And could you tell me where you were at in your life when you encountered this thriller story?
Well, I guess at this point I had been writing my own fiction for several years. And like I said, Teresa and I have been partners. We kind of discovered each other from the Catholic Writers Guild's critique group. And at the time, I was looking for someone that could read my writing that understood the faith elements of it. Because there were some women at the library group that were very helpful, but I wasn't sure that they would necessarily get what I was trying to do in my writing. And Teresa did. And so we were able to share stories, swap chapters, and go back and forth. And so this was one of her, this must have been her, she's got more novels than me. Maybe this was like her 6th or 7th book. I'm not even sure. And usually she writes more for teens, but this one is an adult novel. And it really just struck me, her creativity and, the story just really does grip you, because I think of the little bit of creepiness. And I always recommend it to people during the month of November, not only because of, we're right after Halloween there, but the month of All Saints, and it really is a perfect read for that time of year. So I was reading it chapter by chapter multiple times, so it probably stuck with me, even more than it would if you just picked it up and read it and moved on to the next book. But even so, I think it really makes you stop and think about those who aren't with us any longer, that all these souls, the unknown souls that nobody is praying for, as well as the people in our own lives that we love that have passed, and have we done anything to help them on their journey? Do we remember them? Do we pray for them? Do we offer sacrifices for them? So it really touched me in that way.
It's interesting because you wouldn't necessarily automatically think that contemporary romance and thriller would be ideal critique partners.
Yeah, I guess you wouldn't. But we work well together. Her books have like an element of romance. I don't know if I really have much thriller in mind. A little bit of suspense, maybe. But I think because we both have the same goals and we share the same faith, and I think whether we started that way or not, I think our writing styles are fairly similar in that the way that we add description and dialogue and things like that, it just melded together very well.
So in a way, this wasn't just about accomplishing goals with your art and things like that, but it seems like the relationship itself was of great value to your writing.
Yeah, it is. Writing is so solitary sometimes, and especially if you're in kind of what I think of it as a little niche of this Catholic fiction, and it's easy to feel very alone and like you're the only one doing this. And it's very helpful to have people that are supportive, both practically speaking with writing and with promotion and those types of things, but also spiritually, that understand when you feel like, why am I doing this? Am I wasting my time? Because they encounter the same discouragement, but yet they still rely on the same faith and the same goal of being faithful to what you feel that God is calling you to do, what He called to write, despite the fact that you might not see a lot of immediate material success or promotion, publicity, that type of thing that comes from it.
And so would you say that you would consider your primary audience Catholics, or do you see that you have a greater audience with your own work?
I would say primarily Catholics and Catholic women in particular, but there's a broader Christian audience too, because I'm definitely writing within the bounds of what is contemporary Christian fiction and follow the conventions of romance. And so there are definitely readers that appreciate the stories, and oftentimes I'll see a review by a non-Catholic that, it was interesting because I didn't know about these practices, or I don't really know much about how Catholics live their faith or the devotions or things like that. Now, there's the occasional person that will set it down immediately because it's Catholic and that's not something they want any parts of. But I think by and large, Christian readers are happy to read stories of faith that reflect their own beliefs, but also maybe have something a little different that they were unaware of that's interesting to them.
Ooh, and here we're getting to another point where we talk about that, fiction bringing about relationship and greater understanding, empathy, even if it's outside of your own life experiences.
Yeah, that's something that's really beautiful about fiction and one of my favorite things. And I know I've learned about other, practices of the Christian faith and understand maybe more evangelical Christian worldview than I would had I not ever picked up so many books written by authors that espouse those beliefs and live in that kind of community. And I wouldn't stop them on the street and say, hey, how exactly do you think about, but here I can pick it up and read someone's internal thoughts as a fictional person, but still, and learn more about that.
Absolutely. I just love the way that you word that. Well, and that's why I wanted to focus on fiction. I mean, I read a lot of nonfiction myself, but there's just something meaty about fiction in the world of art, in the world of creativity, that I feel is so necessary that we share. And in my experience, a lot of people seem to feel like once you stop reading aloud to your children, that fiction doesn't matter as much anymore. And they might not think that devoting time and energy to reading good fiction is a worthy pursuit. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I'm always sad when I hear somebody, say that, oh, they were discouraged from reading fiction because it's frivolous. It's a waste of time. And I suppose if you're reading actual garbage, maybe it's a waste of time, but there's value in fiction, not only just for the sake of fiction, for storytelling, for entertainment, for relaxation, for escape, but there's so much more there. There's a wonderful quote by Dean Koontz in his novel Ashley Bell, and I've read some of his novels, not a lot, but this one was about a writer, and I'm going to probably not get the words exactly right, but he says you should put more faith in fiction because it's really the only way you can come at the truth. He says you can come at the truth sideways, which is the only way you really get at it. So again, I probably muddled that a little bit, but it lays out the fact that there's some mechanism by which we understand a truth better from a story than we do from facts listed on a page. Because I think we're hardwired for story. That's how we comprehend all sorts of things in life. And it's easier to internalize and for us to understand, I think, comprehend, and then be able to not necessarily share that with others, but I guess internalize it and make it part of our broader understanding. It's just something that nonfiction can't deliver in quite the same way.
Well, and I know in the type of homeschooling that I do with my kids that they always encourage you to use narratives for learning history. And I think it goes back to that whole idea of how key storytelling is to us as human beings. And I don't understand why we try to ignore that. And we try to say, well, if you're being a serious adult, then you're not engaging in storytelling. And that's, to me, that's like saying, to be a serious adult, I don't exchange oxygen for carbon dioxide. It just, it's in our DNA. Story is.
It is. You think of children too. How much do they love to hear stories about you or about themselves? A story about when they were born, or a story. Sometimes I tell them things from my childhood or teenage years that just are not a big deal, really, just little things, but they sort of latch onto that because it's a story, and that's how they come to know me better.
Oh, it makes me think of a story that my girls ask me over and over to tell them pretty much anytime we eat out, about when my oldest was probably about 1.5, maybe 2. And we were traveling to visit my in-laws, and we stopped at this nice Italian restaurant because that's what was there on the side of the road. And we got our meal, and, it's me and my husband and this toddler, and we enjoyed it. And she was eating her spaghetti, and she's always been, a moderate eater. She doesn't gobble the whole plate, nor does she just pick at it. But she wasn't quite done, and the waiter comes and takes her plate, and she shoots him this look and goes, "Hey!" and points at him as he's trying to walk away with her food. And he did bring it right back. And it's not, but this story just makes my kids crack up. And I think you're right that what they're encountering is something that tells them about themselves and about their experience and about our family culture and family history, even though it seems so inconsequential.
Right, it is. I think And it's the relaying of the story, which is the part of the beauty of reading fiction aloud, that you get all the emotion, and there's some intangible aspects that aren't on the page that come across in the storytelling that, again, help you to know the storyteller and to know the story in a way that isn't just a list of a summary of facts of this first, this happened, which is how we teach children to write stories in the beginning, right? First this, then this, here's the conclusion. And that's the bones of it, but that's not all of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that they tell us over and over that you want to show, not tell. And it's almost like even if you're reading nonfiction, that you're trying to get it to exist in your imagination.
Sure.
That it takes on this life of its own. And I see this with so many different creative pursuits. I used to think that I had zero artistic talent, and then I went to one of those like paint and sip classes with a friend of mine for charity. And I was like, even if this looks terrible, I don't care. So we're painting. And I realized something that was really shocking, and I think it applies to writing as well, that the image that you're painting on the board, even if you are copying something, you're not actually copying that image. You are reproducing what is in your brain, which isn't that image. It's something else. And I think that when we read, it can be the same thing, that the writer might have had one intention, that this book has one existence in the author's mind, and it has a different existence in your mind. And then when you read it aloud, it almost has a third existence. And this is why like book clubs can be so fascinating, because everybody is coming to the table with these different ideas, and that you end up creating a new synthesis that you never that there was no way that the author could have foreseen how that would come out.
That's so true. The couple times I've got to talk with book clubs that I've read one of my books, I am just floored by things they will ask or things that they observe that I didn't even put together. And I've said things to other authors like, I love how you incorporated this, and it really, was resonant to this. And they'll be like, oh, I didn't even intend that, or I didn't. And I found that myself writing, I didn't, until I look back, oh, I didn't even know I did that. And two, when I've had my books are on audiobook format, and I know the first one, listening back to it, to hear the narrator's inflection or how they delivered a particular line, just like, oh, that's so much better than it was in my head. They bring out the humor or different aspects of it that really bring it to life. And it's so fun to hear, other people's, imaginations at work, really.
Well, and that's one thing that I've come to learn, is this whole thing that creativity doesn't exist in a bubble. And even though writing or painting might be a quote unquote solitary action, that art does not exist in a vacuum. It just doesn't. And yes, you can create art for art's sake, and you can create it just for yourself, but it still has a life of its own.
It does.
And that when you get it out there, and when you develop relationships with people and relationships with work, it's just, I just geek out on it. What can I say?
And I finally have kids that are of the age, the older ones, to be reading literature and things that I read, when I was their age. And it's fascinating to hear their takes on them. Just things that we've both read. There's, a classic novel that's going to slip my mind, but, that I had read, and I told my son, oh, I read it in high school. I didn't like it. And he read it and he's like, I loved it. So why did you love it? What is it that you got out of it that I didn't? So it's fascinating to hear that. Again, you come to know somebody through their interpretation, their understanding of the art.
Mm. It's almost like art is essential to our experience. Maybe our creator is an artist. Shock.
I know. That's part of the beauty of whatever you can create, big or small, or writing or painting or woodwork or anything, is we share in the creativity of God. And that's such a beautiful thing. It's just an opportunity to get a little glimpse of part of what he is.
And really, that's all we can handle, is little glimpses.
Yes, I imagine so.
Well, let's talk about the little glimpses that you do in your work. So I've read one of your books, and it's a contemporary romance called Ornamental Graces, a holiday romance. And I know that you write a broad section of fiction. So can you tell me about the types of things that you're creating and putting out into the world?
I seem to be drawn to writing romances, and it's funny that I do that only because I didn't really read romance much before I started writing it. I went through a period of I loved reading when I was a child and a teenager. When I got to college, I was so overwhelmed by reading nonfiction that I didn't read any fiction. And then with my job after that, I spent so much time at night and in the day reading newspapers and magazine articles and journals. That was all I had room for in my brain. So when I resigned, when my son was little, to be home with him and our other children, I went on a binge of reading fiction. I was like, I'm going to make up for all those years. And I just read and read and read. And I really didn't read much romance. Certainly it wasn't the conventional romance. It was more elements of romance in other books. But yet when I started to write, which is something I did almost on a lark, just let's see if I can do this National Novel Writing Month thing, what I found I was writing was romance. Like, oh, that's interesting. So then, I went back to reading romance and learning about, how to write what I was reading. So what most often comes out when I sit down and write is a romance, but it's usually one that has some depth to it where the characters are growing in, I don't know if I want to say profound, they're very ordinary ways, but ways that make a difference to them in their lives, where they encounter the need for forgiveness or for some kind of change of heart or a conversion of some type, not necessarily a religious conversion, but a conversion of their spirit, I guess you would say, in a way, a turning away from something to something else. I usually talk about it in terms, at least when among Catholics, as theology of the body fiction, because that's what has heavily influenced my understanding of romance in almost every way. So what Pope John Paul II had to say about the body and its significance for how we live and for how we communicate ourselves and our actions and the intent behind them always plays into what I write, whether I want it to or not. That's what comes out. That's my worldview that seeps into my writing.
And for our listeners who are unfamiliar, could you just give the briefest explanation of how you view John Paul II's theology of the body?
I would say it's simply put, it's the meaning of our bodies that express who we are as man and as woman, and that there are inherent qualities and roles that arise from the fact that we are a man and woman and how we relate to another, and most importantly, how we love and are loved by another person. That's a really short distillation of his magnum opus, but there you go.
That is so significant because how we give and express and receive love from one another impacts how we give and receive and accept love from God.
Exactly. And so oftentimes one of the beautiful things I think about reading Christian romances is seeing the love of God reflected in the characters. And oftentimes, the hero of the book loves in a way that we want to be loved by God, the way he does love unconditionally and freely and totally. And so those are the kinds of characters I like to see in romances, ones that are flawed for sure, but are striving to love in that way and recognize, even subconsciously, but that is how they want and need to be loved by not only other people, but by God above too.
And that's so different from a lot of what I've experienced in the romance genre at large.
Yeah.
That I read your book and I read a couple other romances because in working on my novel, I am clueless on how to write a love story. You want me to write a war scene? We're great. But you want me to write a love subplot? I'm kind of at a loss and feel awkward. And so they're like, well, you need to read what you're going to write. So I was reading some romance, and a lot of it is, like we discussed at the beginning of the show, very materialistic.
Right.
Or the other thing it can be is what shocked me is one of the books I was starting to read was a love story, and this was written for YA. And there was like relationship violence going on. And it was expected that the reader would find this acceptable.
Yeah, that's just, people, again, we talk about the influence of fiction. How do you want to influence people? I want people to come away from a book of mine seeing a relationship that is striving to be authentic, again, not perfect, but moving in that direction to reflect what true love, authentic love should be, not, accept something less than that that's detrimental to them. And I've given a lot of thought to what I read a lot, and I can't just read now and not think of the mechanics of writing and why certain stories grab me, certain ones don't, why certain heroes are more attractive than others. And what I've come to realize is that the most attractive hero and the most compelling story to me is when it is self-sacrifice. And sometimes it's the heroine too, but it's always self-sacrificial love that always is the ones that actually grips me in the heart, that I feel, the ones that, and I'm not much of a crier when I read, but those are the ones that'll bring me to tears, the self-sacrifice, which is perfect, right? Because I realize that's what's mirroring what Jesus Christ did for us. So that's what resonates in my heart. That's what I want to convey in my characters, that love is giving, that it's sacrificial, it's full and total, and so compelling, that kind of, that the first feelings you have of attraction and new love, that kind of feeling is what God feels for us. Now, for us as humans, that kind of wears off, and over waxes and wanes over time and things. But God loves us with that exciting kind of, I can't live without you love. That's what's so beautiful about it.
Mm. Yeah, that gives you something to sit and chew on. When you were talking about a hero that's self-sacrificial, for whatever reason, the one who come to mind for me is Samwise Gamgee in Lord of the Rings. And the thing about him, like, he's one of my favorite characters of all time. I love Lord of the Rings. I know it's not for everybody, but I'm sorry. This is my show and I get to geek out on my favorite book.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing about Samwise Gamgee is he is a hero, but it's in simplicity. That he's never looking for his own glory. He's always looking for service and love and just meeting the challenges that come to him head on. He doesn't go looking for them. And yet the way that he responds to them is with the gifts that he's given in that moment. Like, he responds to the graces he's given in that moment. And I've never actually thought of it that way before. There's something to that his sacrifice, he never knew what he was going to be called to offer and to do. But he just continued to love, and love carried him. And not romantic love, obviously, but love carried him to be a hero. And that's so different from a materialistic view that says essentially violence is what begets heroism.
Right. Yeah, what a great model he is of ordinary love. And I say ordinary just meaning it's common, but it's extraordinary. It shows you how extraordinary the ordinary is, to doing those little things faithfully and just acting upon what you know to do, what is right. And those are the things, those little daily, seem like small actions, are heroic, really.
Yeah. And here we go. Maybe we need that reminder, because sometimes the ordinary is so hard to make it through on a given day.
Yeah. Yeah, it can be. And that's, again, the beauty of telling stories and kind of revealing that these little things are big things. When you arrange them in a certain way and they're motivated by a certain thing, and you look at the story of a life, those little things aren't so little anymore. They're a pattern, that we kind of become what we do and how we've acted. That's becomes who we are.
You mean we don't grow in virtue instantly and overnight?
If only that were true.
I've had a lot of overnights and I ain't there yet.
Me too.
So you get your readers engaged in love stories that revolve around theology of the body. What impact are you looking to have on your readers in your work?
I hope that they walk away with a sense of how love isn't a feeling. And I used to do engaged encounter years ago, and they were real big on saying that love is a decision, not a feeling. It's absolutely true, because the feeling is temporary, but the action and the commitment is permanent. So there's all the wonderful things that I like to write about, that exciting part of love that I talked about that you get in a romance novel, because people are meeting and they're kind of on that precipice of making that commitment together. But there's so much more to that, and that relationship, both physically and emotionally, that intimacy has to abide by certain, I hate to say rules, but there's a certain way that we act that's consonant with how God created us, that ultimately brings joy, even if in the short term it brings some suffering and some sacrifice, that ultimately living in that way, that you're loved and being loved in a way that is compatible with how you were created by God, that will ultimately bring joy. That's kind of a lot to come away with. I also hope they just say, hey, that was a good book and I enjoyed it. But, that on some level they recognize that there's something more going on there as well.
Mm. What impact are you hoping that your work would make on our culture at large?
I guess I'd say two things. One, the older I get, the more that I see that the only way to impact the culture is by changing myself. So I guess to the degree that something I write might have a small influence somewhere in somebody's life, that would be one way. The other way, which is more of a broader thing, is I want to have people be aware that there is Catholic fiction out there, that is a thing, that we have so many Catholics that are totally unaware that it even exists. To the extent that they do know it, they haven't moved beyond Tolkien, which is wonderful. But we won't have another Tolkien unless we have other Catholic writers trying to write to the best of their ability. So, yeah, I would think that I'd hope that people are aware that they can read stories that reflect their own worldview or their own experience of Christianity, that they can recognize themselves maybe a little more easily in than some other books.
That makes sense to me. Well, and the other thing is, like you were saying, the only way to impact culture is to change yourself. And I might be going out on a limb, but I'm betting that your creative work does change you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, people often say they write the book that they needed to read or to experience. So oftentimes as I'm writing too, there's, whatever theme is in that particular book, whether it's, some of mine, I'm thinking freedom or mercy, all of those kinds of things. There's certainly lessons that I take away from them that, the characters are learning, but, we're learning right alongside them too.
Mm. It still just blows me away how all of these things, like you were saying, that people wonder if what they're doing matters. When you're engaged in a creative work, you wonder if what you're doing matters. But you look at all the things that we've just listed off in the last few minutes,
right,
that are so important, and they can come from this thing that we can fool ourselves into thinking is insignificant in the moment.
Yeah. Well, when you first asked about me picking a particular work, and I think when I emailed you, I said, oh, that's tough for me because I read these books and I internalize them, but I forget them. I forget the details. But I bank on the fact that I have internalized them, that if I'm not remembering details and settings and scenes and character names, there's something I've taken away from that's now part of me. It was this external object, but it came in through my imagination. And now in some way, I'm a different person. It might be a very small way. I don't think there's a lot of books I have that would say, just changed my life. But there's little things in there that now I've internalized that become part of my understanding of others and how I see the world and perceive other people.
That's great. And so even this is helping you in that struggle for greater virtue.
Yes, absolutely.
So I would like to know, what special things do you do to foster your creative process?
Oh, I wish I could say I had some great formula, but most of all, I think, and this is not because I chose this by design, but because this is what's available to me, I allow myself the freedom to daydream. And so much of my writing was done with little children. Now I have a little bit older children, but it's always a crazy amount of busyness going on around me. So sometimes when I can't even get to the keyboard, I can always have a few moments to dream. And there's so many, I don't know how many of my books were written when I was riding around a baby trying to get them to take a nap in the back seat. And there were so many scenes that would come to my mind, or details, or this conversation. And then I would come home and scribble them down, or eventually I got a little voice recorder so I could do it while I was driving. I think that was before I had a smartphone. But I think that's still the beauty of it, because my daughter was asking me last night, how far I was coming. And she knows I have these 3 books, these 3 projects. And I realized I have some of them somewhat written, but I said, oh, but it's all worked out in my mind, which I think is the biggest hurdle, because I've allowed myself all this space to when I have a few minutes, or when I'm doing chores that don't require a lot of concentration, like doing dishes, or like the driving or showering or something. I just allow my mind to go there and imagine these characters and what they're doing. And I think that's been the biggest part of the process. And I think not only does it help with the overall story, but I also think it helps with dialogue, actually, just to watch these characters play out their scenes in my head and not feel like I'm forced on the page to come up with what this one says, but just to imagine them and how they speak and communicate with one another.
So they just exist in your imagination.
They do.
As full people.
Yeah. And sadly for them, they never get to leave. So I revisit them years later and they're like, my story's done. No, your story's never done.
Oh, man. Well, and I find it interesting that you started writing, or at least the way you were describing it, was in NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, which for those people who don't know is November. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Right. Well, at the time, I had some free time. My husband had traveled a lot for work at that time, and particularly during November. He would be gone Sunday through Thursday or something. And I had 2 children who were very small. And so I had gaps in the evening where, I'd heard of National Novel Writing Month, and I had someone I went to grade school with, I haven't even talked to for decades, but she posted something about it on Facebook or something. I'm like, I could try that. I've always wanted to write some fiction. I did a lot of writing for work, but it was always news releases, columns, newsletter articles, position papers, all kinds of nonfiction type things. And I'd only really dabbled in short stories, in my early 20s maybe. So I thought, well, I'm just going to do this. So I needed an idea, and I found this little newspaper clipping. It was about lost gold. That this is actually very interesting to me, that this is still a story that I see crop up in the news from time to time. But there is a supposedly lost gold somewhere in Pennsylvania that was making its way to the Philadelphia Mint during the Battle of Gettysburg. And the gold has been lost. The men taking it were dead. Anyway, there's supposed to be somewhere. Sometimes I see Western Pennsylvania, sometimes up north. And my story that I was writing is set in Williamsport. But I had this newspaper clipping just about this hunt for this gold. And I thought, well, this is as good a place as any to start. I had, like a 200-word article. I'm like, okay, I'll make something into this. And I just sat at the computer and wrote and just spewed words out, not knowing if they were good or bad, or if they had any kind of story that was cohesive in any way. But that was the incentive I needed to do that. And so I at least came out with 50,000 words that I had to improve upon. And it took years to get that story to where it was cohesive and not so poorly written. But just doing it was the biggest hurdle. And that was the way I started. So I think National Novel Writing Month is great for that, to just force you to sit down and write words. Because as everybody says, you can't edit something you haven't written. Just write it. Then you can fix it.
I've actually participated in Nano twice. And the first one, I wasn't able to finish my manuscript. But the second one, which was in 2019, I did finish. And that's actually the novel that I'm working on right now. And it turned into a series of 4 books that all live in my head. And so I feel you when you have all of these characters, and mine is 20th century historical fiction. So not only do I have the characters, but I have their world
Yeah,
existing in my head. And it's kind of tiring because it's like, I know your story, but I don't know how to tell it yet. And so I'm working on that.
yeah. It's a process. And mine is like, well, I think I can tell it, but I can't find time to get to write it. That's the other hurdle. That's again why National Novel Writing Month is good. It makes you create some discipline in your life to write.
Yes. And I find it interesting that when I did it, I had young kids. And when you did it, you had young kids as well. And I mean, we're talking about a time in your life where you don't know if you have time to shower or, and the idea of putting on makeup is just non-existent in my world. But I'm sure that some people struggle with that too. And yet you can find this time. It's almost like an inspired time in some ways.
It is. And it's not a time that drains you. I find that like last night I wrote, I don't know, 500 or 600 words for something I do with another authors. It's called a collective story where I wrote the first part, we handed off to another author. It's going to go through 6, 7 authors and it'll be a short story when it's done. So it was just something I didn't need to invest a lot of time in. It's not, a novel. I just needed to get it done. And the words came easily and I was like, ooh, I felt energized, not, not like my energy had been depleted, but like, oh, I could go on and do something else now. So it's kind of counterintuitive. You think I've got all this work to do at the keyboard, but it's kind of rejuvenating work.
I find writing a really helpful way for me to organize my thoughts, and I call it collating them. That I actually use a program called 750 Words, and you just word vomit 750 words every day, and it gamifies it for you. You can earn badges and things like that. But I find that I feel so much better.
Yeah.
After getting it all out.
I know. And it's in fiction, but in I wouldn't call it nonfiction because I'm not ever publishing it, but journal writing. From the time I was about 13, I kept a journal and I kept a daily journal. I have them bagged in my attic and they're the most boring and embarrassing things ever written. But I'll tell you, they had such value. And I still, when I'm upset about something or there's something just aggravating me, to sit down and write it out longhand with my pen in cursive, page after page, everything looks better after I've done that. It's, like you said, it organizes my thoughts, allows me to express them. And I always unfailingly come away feeling not that everything's solved, maybe, but it's always better after I've done that. Cheap therapy.
It is. It is. I have the burning question. Did you ever publish that first Nano book that you wrote?
Yes, that is, let's see, 1, 2, 3, was it the third or fourth novel published? Rightfully Ours. It went under several names until it was cleaned up and changed. But yeah, it was published in 2017, I think, with Full Quiver Publishing. So yeah, it didn't look like it looked when it started, but the bones of the story were still there.
And so how many years start to finish was that manuscript?
7.
It's funny because that's also how many years it took Rhonda Ortiz for her first novel. And I'm looking at that and going, I started mine in 2019. We're going on 3 years. I've still got 4 years to go. Oh,
it's well, but I wrote books after that, between the writing of that first draft and that publication. I wrote 2 novels in there. I wrote Stay With Me and Ornamental Graces, but they were all, I sort of left the first one behind for a while and moved on to this story. And the next story, actually, I wrote All in Good Time then to the first draft. So I kept moving on to these other stories where I was kind of perfecting the process of writing. I just cleaned up those ones before I went back to that first one, which probably because it needed more work than the other ones, So every one of them, and I know some people leave manuscripts like that and don't publish them because they're not worth it, but I guess I just can't. The economy of the situation bothers me. I thought I invested a lot of time and I'm going to fix this and make it work one way or the other. So.
Right. And when you've had those characters living in your head for so long.
Yeah, they were trapped.
You probably wanted to just let them live outside of your mind too.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. Yeah. It's satisfying to see their story complete.
Well, and that's one thing I have to say I found interesting about when I read your book, Ornamental Graces, is that these people did live eventful lives. and that their experiences, and I don't want to give any spoilers or anything, but I'm reading it, and a lot of the experiences that these characters had, I had either lived through or lived through with close friends of mine. And it was, I have to say, other quote unquote clean or sweet romances that I've read had lighter themes.
Mm-hmm.
But when they have a light theme, sometimes you miss out on the humanity of the character.
No, I like lighter themed books too, I guess depending on the mood, but I always hope for something more to take away from there too. And, ultimately, if somebody tells me that the characters in my book are realistic, that's probably one of the best compliments they can give me to my mind, because I want to write real people with real situations. Now, if they aren't real, their stories resolve maybe a little too, I wouldn't say quickly, because I tend to write stories that drag out over years, but maybe more neatly than they will happen in real life. But again, those experiences, I hope, resonate with people as real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they definitely were, like to the point of tears.
Oh.
But that's okay, because that, like you said, we're going to experience the sufferings, but we're going to experience the redemption, the love, the mercy as well. And I think that's shown. So I have a genre question.
Mm-hmm.
This has been burning in my mind. I would like to know why the expected trope with romance is that it's all about the courtship, but not like the relationship post-courtship. I'm just curious.
For my part, I guess I would say it comes from that, all those bubbly, exciting attraction feelings. I think that, again, if I look hard at it, maybe that's reflecting, again, the love we hope to have imperfectly here, but ultimately from God. There are books, and I have one book that's written after a marriage, kind of a marriage that's it's not a typical romance. I usually call it just Christian fiction, that is a marriage that's struggling and trying to get back on its feet. But yeah, that's not a romance. That's a that's a different genre. I think it's just that excitement factor. I think it's that we all want to relive that, or experience for the first time, that kind of excitement, that kind of discovery of somebody. Here's this one person that knows me, and that I know, unlike any other relationship, in a different way, that accepts all of me, my good and my bad. And again, unless I'm saying this, I'm thinking, oh my goodness, I'm just reflecting back again how we hope to love and be loved ultimately by God. And whether we know that or not, we have that heart-shaped hole that we're trying to fill. And I think romance is one of the obvious ways, in a legitimate way, that we fill that in a temporal world. Ultimately, it's not going to completely satisfy, but like the sacrament of matrimony, it should be a reflection of what we ultimately will experience.
Both the love, the fulfillment, and the sacrifice.
Yeah. Unfortunately, they don't come without the sacrifice. So yeah.
No, they don't. But it's all worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think sets your work apart from the rest of the genre?
I don't know that I'm completely unique, because you'll find other people writing what I write, but there are not a whole lot of people writing contemporary Catholic romance. It's a handful. And so I think that's what makes it different. And then, to the extent that I'm trying to make it, as you say, a little deeper, or more reflect that theology of the body, it's not just a sweet romance that has, a rosary thrown in, or some little other kind of incidentals that the characters are Catholic. But I think that the characters, whether they're Catholic or not at the time of the novel, still kind of reflect that kind of Catholic worldview ultimately, in how they live and believe.
And what do you have coming down the pipe for us?
Well, I have 3 books that I'm working on, and I maybe foolishly committed to somebody a date for the 3rd of them. So now I have to have 3 out. These are the ones that have been living mostly in my head. So the first is a contemporary romance called Lost and Found, that I hope is kind of lighthearted, in that the hero is actually kind of an amateur Bigfoot hunter. And but there's a
I
lot
love it. I
going
love it.
on. That's maybe absorbed from all the real life Bigfoot talk that I've had in my household. But also deal a lot with people's perceptions of themselves, their own bodies, their physical, I don't know, I'm talking issues that people have surrounding their weight and their attractiveness and their appearance. So that's kind of what's subtly going on there. And the next book is an odd book. I'm not sure how to classify yet, that I was calling The Light Between, about, because I guess you'd ultimately say it's a second chance romance, but there should be some intrigue in there as well. And the third one is the young adult book that I've been really anxious to write, because I already wrote a short story related to it called On Graffiti Road, about a young woman who changes schools late in high school, and her experience of going from, well, she hasn't changed school, she's going from homeschooling to public school, and some challenges she encounters. And let's see, how could I say it? She has a little experience, a bad experience with the occult. And but there'd be some romance in there as well, not related to the occult. So those are the three lined up. And then if I get those finished, there's a historical book that I've been had in the back of my mind for years, because I'm put off by the amount of research it will require. But eventually I will get to that.
What time period is that one?
It's 1890s Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania. So I have a lot of, I visited that area because it's not far from where I live several times. So I have some knowledge of it, but having not written day-to-day details of that time period, I know I have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, that's why in that second NaNoWriMo, when I completed the book that I completed as a 20th century historical fiction, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into.
Yeah, you really don't know what you don't know until you start writing.
Oh my goodness. And I don't have any like background classes in creative writing or anything like that. And so, I'm learning craft as I go, and I'm listening to these other historical fiction novelists. And they're like, well, I usually spend 1 to 2 years on research. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And I'm very good at research, actually. I was in debate in high school. I've got mad nerd credentials here. So it's not the act of research, but it's the volume of research to make it real. Because like you said, in the Catholicism in your work, you don't want to be just throw in a rosary and call it good. Look, it's Catholic. You don't want to throw in a tin beer stein and say, oh, look, it's 19th century, and call it a day, because it's so flat.
Right. That's where all those little beats that I don't think about when I write contemporary, like picking up a mug or something. Well, then I have to think, oh, well, in 1890s at this level of income, what kind of beverage holder would they have had? And how do I, it's just so many little details to make it right, to make it authentic.
Yeah, I think it makes it a little easier that I'm doing 20th century, but, and the fact that it's 4 books, I'm like, it's 4 books in 3 places I've never been to, in a time period I've never lived through. I'm like, what was I thinking? This is madness. But at the same token, it's, if you stop and you stop looking at the work and you just do the work, then I think it gets enjoyable.
It does. And sometimes just spewing things out with inaccuracies that you can then go back and correct is helpful too, because it's so easy to get bogged down in the research, and then you get so off track, it's hard to get back on again.
Right. And especially when you're like me and you're not just doing research, but that you're learning craft and you're writing and you're editing and you're revising. I think I need to compartmentalize and like do one for a while and then do another. And I don't exactly know what order those boxes go in. But that's one of the great things about doing this podcast, is I can talk to people that know what they're doing.
And one of the beautiful things about writing is you can do it your own way. You can hear all kinds of suggestions in different ways, and then take what you like from this one and not the other one, and what works and suits you best, and do it your way. Because I don't think any 2 authors' processes are identical. We all kind of come at it just a wee bit differently.
Which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Or else we wouldn't have a variety in our world.
Right. Yeah. Stories are unique to the person who wrote them.
What would be the easiest place for us to access the stuff you've got going on?
My website is the easiest place to find all the possibilities. So that's carolynastfalk.com, and I have a book tab there. And then you can see, because the books are all available on paperback and ebook and audiobook, Amazon, but other places as well. So that's the simplest one-stop shop.
All right. Well, we have a one-stop shop for adventure for you right now. It's time for the rando round. Are you prepared?
I am ready.
All right. I've got my list of 100 overcaffeinated questions, and you get to pick your dice. We have pink sparkles or tie-dye.
Oh, tie-dye. Let's go with that.
Tie-dye. Yes. Yes. I'm so excited about the tie-dye. I have a thing for tie-dye. Okay. It's very joyful. All right. So let's see what we rock and roll today. Why don't we try 71? What are 3 books you would recommend?
Okay, let's see. I'm just going to come with what comes at the top of my mind. Stephanie Lansom's In a Far Off Land, which is a historical romance set in Hollywood. It's fascinating. You talk about historical research. She's done a fantastic job. It's a sort of retelling of The Prodigal Son, and it's beautifully written. She's very talented and hardworking author. So that would be one right there. 2, let's see. The Grace Crasher by Faro. It is a contemporary Catholic romance that is much in the style that I write, so I guess I identify it with very well, but it's romance with a lot of humor and also a lot of deeper work going on there with the characters as well. Third, I'm going to say Elizabeth Byler Young's is, which book of hers should I pick? The Bright Unknown. She is not Catholic, but the characters in this book are, or at least one is, and it's just, she's a gifted writer too. Beautifully written story that starts in an insane asylum, actually, and is moving and powerfully written. Really, the books I've read by her, I could say that about all of them. So I would say, The Bright Unknown by Elizabeth Byler Young, who actually happens to be kind of local to me. So there you go.
Very exciting. And you don't read a whole lot of stories that take place in a mental institution. So that's, and it was kind of funny. I was looking up what the intention for the month was to pray for, and it's actually for mental health. And so
okay.
There you go for November. Yeah. And I mean, this is going to air in December, but y'all can pray for people with mental health struggles.
Anytime. Yep.
Anytime, because we could use it.
Yep.
Let's see what else we come up with here. 100. You're in your van. You hear Journey's song, Open Arms, come on the radio. What do you do?
I leave it on and reminisce about my youth. Although I don't know that song has a particular memory for me, but I know that this Faithfully was a theme from my high school prom. So,
yeah. Oh, who doesn't love Journey? I mean, seriously, there's a reason I added this question to this list. All right. 31. Describe the color yellow to a blind person.
Yellow is brightness and balm, and my daughter always has a fondness for buttery yellow. So I'll say buttery because it can be smooth and rich and delicious.
I love it. And the last question I ask all of my guests is, what gives you hope right now?
I think the natural world around me gives me hope now and all the time. I find that anytime I am mildly dejected or depressed or anything, if I go outside in the beauty of God's creation, I am always hopeful. There's constancy about the world and a natural beauty and a cyclical expression of death and growth that always provides hope. You see it more in spring, but I think I see it all year round. So I would say that the natural world always brings me hope and does today.
I'm grateful for this time I got to spend with the talented storyteller and thoughtful woman, Carolyn Astfalk. You can find her works at carolynastfalk.com. If you enjoyed listening to this conversation, click on the follow button for more tales every other Tuesday. And in the meantime, read stories that matter because you are living one.